Let us pray. Almighty God and Father of all mercies, we thy servants come before thee today to give thee thanks for all thy goodness and loving kindness to us and to all whom you have made. We bless thee for our creation, preservation, and all the blessings of this life, but above all, for your immeasurable love in the redemption of the world by our Lord Jesus Christ, for the means of grace and for the hope of glory. We ask you today, O Lord, to accept our prayers for all mankind. Let the light of thy gospel shine upon all nations, and may as many as have received it live as becomes it. Be gracious unto thy church. Grant that every member in the same, in his vocation and ministry, may serve thee faithfully. Send down thy blessings upon us, our relations, our friends, and our neighbors. Be merciful to those who are in any trouble, to the sick, to them that mourn, to the lonely and the oppressed, remembering those for whom we now pray either silently or aloud. We ask, O Lord, that it may please thee to comfort and relieve all of them according to their several necessities. Give them patience and give them a happy issue out of all their afflictions. And this we ask in Jesus Christ's name, saying, Ainta, Irhango, Sanctite Ferinai, Delef de Deleas, Gwenaya de Taris, Megisinanef, Fayina in Yalfinef, Dairo in Hedeth, Ionoth, Benoith, Amada Lina in Dathan, Feli Mine Warin, Aknach Awan, Ni Grofene, Eithgarweth Ni Negoth, Canasinai, Janolinas, Argail Lachaim, Gagoneth, in us, I said, Amen.
Actair Apostolion penod cantaf adnodau 1 tan 11. Annual Theophilus. Ysgrifennais yn faith lyfr cantaf am y pethau aeth Iesu ati i'w gwneud a'i dysgu, gan iddo gael a'i gymryd yn ôl i fyny i'r nefoedd. Can mynd dywedodd wrth yr apostolion beth oedd am iddyn nhw a'i wneud yn nerth yr ysbryd glân. Am bron 6 wythnos ar ôl iddo gael a'i groeshoelio, dangosodd a'i hun iddyn nhw dro ar ôl tro, a phrofi a tu hwnt i bob amheuaeth a'i fod yn fyw. Roedd yn siarad â nhw am beth mae teyrnasiad Duw yn ei olygu. Un o troion hynny pan oedd yn cael pryd o fwyd gyda nhw, dwedodd fel hyn: Peidiwch gadael Jerusalem, nes byddwch wedi derbyn a roedd mae bainhad wedi ei addo. Rydych yn cofio fy mod wedi siarad am hyn o'r blaen. Roedd Ioan yn bedyddio gyda'r dŵr, ond mewn ychydig ddyddiau cewch chi eich bedyddio gyda'r ysbryd glân. Pan oedd y disgyblion yn cyfarfod gyda Iesu, roeddwn nhw'n gofyn iddo o hyn. Arglwydd, ai dyma pryd rwyt ti'n mynd i ryddau Israel a'i gwneud yn wlad annibynnol unwaith eto? Ateb Iesu oedd, Duw sy'n benderfynu pethau felly. Does ddim rhaid i chi wybod beth ydy'r amserlen mae Duw wedi ei threfnu. Ond bydd yr ysbryd glân yn disgyn arnoch chi ac yn rhoi nerth i chi dweud amdana fi wrth bawb yn Jerusalem, a Judea, yn Samaria, a drwy'r byd i gyd. Yna ar ôl iddo dweud hynny, cafodd ei godi i fyny i'r awyr o flaen ei llygaid. Dam y gwmwl yn dod o'i gwmpas a diflannodd ei golwg. Tra oedden nhw'n syllu i'r awyr, yn edrych arno'n mynd, yn sydyn, dyma 2 ddyn mewn dillad gwyn yn ymddangos wrth eu hymyl nhw a dweud, Chi, Galileaid, beth ydych chi ei wneud yma yn syllu'r i'r awyr? Mae Iesu wedi cael ei gymryd i'r nefoedd oddi wrthoch chi. Ond yn union i'r ynfath ac y gwelwch yn mynd, bydd yn dod un ôl eto. Gagoniant am ei air arglwydd.
Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven, 2 men stood by them in white apparel and said, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken up from you, shall so come in like manner as you have seen him go into heaven. When I was a boy, when I was a schoolboy, I, like many, played rugby, and I was a centre. I was the outside centre. Now, looking at me today, you might not think that. I was thickly built. For a 16-year-old boy, I was rather large. I was the Mike Phillips of Hereford Cathedral School before Mike Phillips was even born. I was reasonably fast for a 16-year-old, but I did not have Mike Phillips' hands. I really had terrible hands. I was voted most likely to mess up the offload. But I had one saving grace, that if you got me the ball and I did not drop it, I could crash into the line and get us a few yards each carry. And so I used to love that. Except that there was one part of the game that I detested. It's something that seemed to fall to centers at times. It's charging down the kick. Well, you have seen this on television. One of the backs of the other team gets the ball in his hands, and he's going to kick it out of danger. And someone charges down with the hands in the air, hopefully blocking the kick. Much like an American football game with a punter, they try to block the punter. Well, as you can imagine, this is a low percentage play. Nonetheless, it fell to me, and I have to confess, I was really rather half-hearted about the task. Because it seemed to me, as a 16-year-old, there was little profit in making this long run with my arms waving in the air, hoping to block a kick, that he would undoubtedly get off, and then here I am, having made a run for nothing, out of breath, potentially offsides, and having to go all the way back whence I came in order to get back into the play. On a particularly rainy February afternoon, a rather large crowd, a big match with a rival, I happened to be there, and sure enough, one of the fullbacks have the ball just about his own 10-yard line and is going to make the kick. So I lumber down with my arms in the air, really with one foot ready to go back upfield. But lo and behold, perhaps because of the wet, I actually blocked it. I was shocked, and so was he. We were both startled. We stood there, completely confused, until a loud voice came across the field, "Go and get the ball." Actually, there was a bit more profanity in it, but I have to clean it up for church. Go and get the ball. The ball has drifted into the goal area, and I see my moment, as does he. One of us has the potential to be the hero, the other the goat. And now if Hollywood were writing this script, I would gracefully charge down, slide in, gather up the ball, touch it down for a try. I would be the hero to my teammates, a credit to my family, and perhaps to the new Irish girl in the Form 5, I might actually be a manly man and perhaps boyfriend material. Unfortunately, Hollywood do not write the scripts that play out on the playing fields of mid-Wales. In fact, I lumbered and stumbled down, and rather than gracefully gathering in the ball and scoring the winning try in the waning moments, I fumbled it, knocked it on, and we all watched it dribble into touch. Whereupon the other team receives a scrum at the 5. They have the put-in a desultory and rather depressing end to the match. And all because I didn't go and get the ball. We have here today the story of the Ascension. Today is the Sunday of the Ascension in the calendar, the day in which we celebrate Jesus' return to heaven, the bodily ascension into heaven. And we see him surrounded here, gathered together with his disciples on this particular day. And they have been with him through a lot. They have been with him as he performs the miracles. They have been with him as he goes to the cross. They have seen him after the resurrection. And now today, they see him go into heaven. And perhaps rather naturally, they, like us, stood about and watched him go. Clearly one of the most amazing things that they had ever seen. If I had levitated from this pulpit to the ceiling, I dare say I would have captured quite the audience. Everyone staring up into heaven. And as they are staring up into heaven, seeing this miraculous event, lo, two men stood by them in white apparel and said, "Ye men of Galilee, why stand you gazing up into heaven?" What they are really saying is, "Ye men of Galilee, why are you staring up into heaven? Go and get the ball." Because what they are doing at this moment is forgetting what it is that they have just been told. They have just been told by Jesus that their job is to go out into the world to make disciples of all nations. They have just been told that their mission is to carry on his mission in the world. And instead of doing or getting about the business of what it is that they have been told, they have been caught standing, gazing into heaven, forgetting that which they are supposed to be doing. Now, as I say, it's a rather natural reaction, but it is not what Jesus has commanded them to do. It is another natural reaction to us as well in the modern era. In the modern era, we spend a lot of time, especially Protestants, we spend a lot of time worrying about our personal relationship with Jesus. We spend a lot of time worrying about whether we are right with him. A lot of our time, in other words, is spent staring up into heaven and not looking about us to see what it is that we need to be doing in completing his mission. And one reason for that, of course, is completing the mission is a bit daunting. Completing the mission is hard. It requires us to actually go out and put ourselves out there. It requires us to take on uncomfortable roles. It requires us to go out and preach the gospel. Now, we all know that in New York that can be a very dangerous thing, literally. There are many in our society, in 21st century America, in the 21st century Western world, who do not want to hear us preach the gospel. They want us to leave your religion at home. Religion belongs in the church, not out here on the street. And we imbibe some of that feeling as well. It seems a bit pushy to go out into the world and preach. And we have all, by the way, encountered the street preachers. I do all the time. And sometimes, because of the way I'm dressed, they zoom in on me. A couple of weeks ago, I was walking down Broadway near Times Square, and there was one of those preachers, and he saw me and said, "And you too are going to hell." I thought, well, he may be right if I don't play my cards right. But very few of us, it seems to me, are called to that role. In fact, what the writer of Acts and what Jesus seems to be telling us is we are called to proclaim the message in 1,000 little ways every single day. We are not called to go find a soapbox. It would that we could find a soapbox and go stand in Times Square and scream at the crowds passing by. We're not called necessarily to get the PA system at work and read from the Bible at lunch. We are perhaps called each and every day in 1,000 little ways to bring the message of love and caring and redemption to to everyone we meet. And that might take the form of a word of encouragement, of a helping hand, or even sitting silently with someone who grieves. We are, in other words, called to follow the words of St. Francis of Assisi, who once said, "In everything we do, preach the gospel, and sometimes even use words." Jesus calls us to go out into the world, to fill it with his life-giving and loving Spirit. And it doesn't mean bringing the Bible along to thump it. For those of you who went to churches kind of like what I did, that's exactly what we did, right? I'd stand up here and I'd wave the thing. And I'm preaching the gospel. And you say, yeah, I don't think I'm doing that. But fortunately for us, that's not what he calls us to do. He calls us to love, to show the world his love through our love. There was once a great Welsh preacher who was riding the bus, and he encountered a man all dressed in white. And he said to the man, "What is it that you do for Jesus?" And of course he did it with a thick Valleys accent. And the man said, "I bake." And the preacher said, "Yes, I know that. But what is it that you do for Jesus?" And the man said, "I bake." And that's what we need to remember. Preachers in this world are not those who dress up in fancy dress. The preachers of this world are the fisherman and the tax collector and the office worker and the banker and the computer person and the street sweeper and the old age pensioner. The preachers of this world are his followers, called to do his work in this world, called to bring his message to a wanting, waiting, and very desperate world. And it isn't often easy, always easy, and sometimes it is embarrassing, but it is nonetheless what we are called to do, each and every single one of us. We are, in other words, in the very same position as those apostles there 2,000 years ago. We are very much like them. We are very much standing about, waiting to hear those words. Stop staring into heaven. This is the playing field. Go and get the ball. Amen. Jesus said, sorry.
welcome everybody. I'd also like to wish everyone here, all the mothers, a very happy Mother's Day. And I'd like to just announce that our next service, which is on June the 12th, directly after the service will be our annual meeting. At that point, we will be discussing church affairs, budget, things that are important for us going forward. So I appreciate it if you all attend. And after that, that concludes our worship for this year, and we'll start up again on September 11th. Look forward to seeing everybody. The Welsh Women's Club of New York is going to meet on June 4th for its annual fundraiser. So if anybody would be interested in attending, please contact Colleen Kennedy for the details. And I think those are the announcements for today, so I'd ask those accepting the offering to come forward, please.
and this is going to be the end of our service, our somewhat informal memorial to Nancy Williams. I was trying to find an image or saying, some way to start this, introduce this section, and I kept seeing an image of Nancy in my mind, sitting off to the side, smiling, sitting in the back maybe, at church, St. David's Society, in a local bar after church. There she was, smiling sphinx-like, inscrutable, Mona Lisa-like, mysterious. She never quite got to the Cheshire Cat grin, but I always figured it was in there. Nancy Louisa Williams, born on the 1st of December, 1928, to Ranald Cecil Williams and Edith Edmonds Williams in Pontypridd. Ranald was a tailor, like his father, Thomas Henry Williams, from Fishguard, and Ranald's mother, Louisa. Now, this is part of a genealogy that David Williams put together for a second cousin we found of Nancy's, Matthew Skews. Excuse me if I mispronounce Skews, I've never heard it. But if I may quote David to Matthew, Nancy was a friend of mine for decades, and I always loved her and enjoyed being around her. I don't know how well you knew her, but I will tell you that she was very beautiful and always perfectly coiffed. She had a powerful presence and commanded attention, but always with a gentle smile and friendly demeanor. She was a lovely host, had a beautiful apartment in New York. In years past, we would travel as a group to various Welsh events in North America and had lots of laughs together. I was very saddened to get the news of her death. I will always remember her with great fondness and appreciation for the loyal friend that she always was to me and to many others in the Welsh community in New York. A good friend of Nancy's for a long time could not be here today. She wanted to very much, but her doctor suggested that at the age of 90, perhaps she didn't really need to cross the pond to speak in person, so she sent this letter. Recollections of my long friendship with Nancy Williams. My name is Betty Hillis, formerly Davis, and I live in Port Talbot, across the bay from Swansea in South Wales. Nancy lived in Porth in the Rhondda Valley. She and I met in college in South Wales in 1947. She was a very vivacious, friendly girl, and we became such good friends that we shared a room in our last year. Nancy's first job as a teacher was in Lincolnshire, mine in Yorkshire. If our holidays coincided, we traveled together on the train from Sheffield to Cardiff. Nancy then went to teach in London, and I returned to Port Talbot. Having Nancy in London was very useful. If our holidays coincided, I could use her flat. If they didn't, I could still go to stay, and we topped and tailed in Nancy's single bed. We were both much slimmer in those days. In 1961, Nancy decided to go round the world, starting off in New York, but she liked it there so much she never moved. We wrote regularly, exchanging news, and when Nancy came home, she always spent time with my parents and myself in Port Talbot. When she retired, until her brother John died, she came home every summer to avoid the sticky parts of July and August, as she put it. By this time I had married and was living in Hertfordshire, but I kept my parents' house in Port Talbot. The routine was always the same. I met Nancy at Heathrow. She spent a few days in Croxley Green with us, and then Nancy and I drove down to Port Talbot, where we would visit with a lot of my friends, most of whom had met Nancy in Port Talbot or in New York, where they went for holidays in the USA. After 2 weeks, I drove her up to Porth, where she and John had a busy time spring cleaning their home. The last week of the holiday, Nancy spent with Eileen, who lived in Essex. I also visited Nancy in New York on several occasions. One of these visits must have been close to St. David's Day. I went with Nancy to a women's meeting at the Welsh church where there was a demonstration of how to make Welsh cakes. After John's death, Nancy did not continue to visit Wales, but we kept in touch on the telephone about every 2 or 3 months. I last spoke to Nancy on the 1st of December 2014, her birthday. A mutual friend died before that Christmas, and I rang again to tell Nancy, but although her phone rang, there was no reply. I did this on a regular basis every few weeks at different times and days. I could not understand why the phone was ringing but not being answered. I rang Carol, Nancy's neighbor in Porth, and Nancy's cousin Linda in Porth Call. But there was still no news. So about October last year, I gave up and accepted that Nancy had died or was too ill to talk to anyone. This Easter, a friend of mine was going to New York and volunteered to go to Nancy's apartment block to see what she could find out. She rang from New York to say that Nancy had only just died in March. The timing was a great surprise, but we were all very grateful to an end to the frustration we all felt for so long. We all feel very sad about the way Nancy died, but whenever I think of her, I'll remember the smiling, vivacious girl I knew with a red lipstick. I'd hoped to read this to you myself, but my doctor did not advise such a long flight. So thank you, Pab Hwyl Chiagid. And if the person who reads this can find Loran Jones, a friend of Nancy's who lived in New Jersey, would you please pass on my good wishes? I taught her at Cumberraven Comprehensive School. Thank you. Graduating from Teachers College, on to Lincolnshire, London, here in New York. Through a social contact, she got an interview with IBM and was hired. As I understand it from the secretarial ranks, she moved up to management, one of the first women to do so. And I don't know if you're going to use this line, so if you are, you'll hear it twice. I'm stealing this from Loran. There she was, IBM, our Nancy, the lonely life vest in a sea of dark navy suits. Nancy lived at 345 East 86th Street, and Mr. Meyer Sasson, the president of the board, is here. Would like to say a few words.
Good afternoon, all. I'm very happy to be able to participate in this memorial for, can you hear me well? Okay, in this memorial for our dear friend, Nancy Williams. My wife, who's here, Fanny, raise your hand so they know who you are, and I met Nancy in the 70s, so it's not recent, when she moved into our building. The building opened in 1971. We may have known her for a longer time than most of you, perhaps, not sure. At the time, we were a rental building that converted into a co-op around 1980. That's important because Nancy then, we had to manage the building. Nancy served on the board and was also an advisor for many, many years. A natural friendship developed among several neighbors, several families, several single women that lived in our building. Sadly, most of whom have passed away by now. Nancy was found by Ilse Gerald, a very close friend who Nancy had given her key to her apartment in case of an emergency. What more emergency than this one? Huh? And by Bruce Peterson, who's here. Put your arm up. Thank you, Bruce. A board member and close friend of Nancy. Another neighbor called Esther Haddad, some of you may know her, or have heard of her, also a board member and a close friend of Nancy, called the Welsh Society, the Foreign Office in London, the British Embassy, the police, the morgue, anyone that was willing to listen, because her concern, and which is the concern of all of us that were close to her, was to make sure that Nancy got a decent burial. But to no avail, because nothing can be done by law until an executor is found and has accepted. And the executor we then learned it was Mr. Jose Fernandez, also a former board president and longtime resident to the building. Please, put your hand up. Thank you. Who, with his wife, Sarah, that sadly already passed away, were very, very close to Nancy. For Nancy to have put her last will and testament of what would happen after she wasn't here in the hands of Mr. Fernandez means that their relationship and the relationship with Mr. Fernandez's wife was very, very special. So Mr. Fernandez went to work on this as soon as he was named, and perhaps instead of me saying a couple more sentences, I'd like him to say what he has done so you can hear it directly from him. Jose, can you what have you done already for Nancy? Can you please speak? And you can come here, yes, because if not, it'll be hard for them to.
Good afternoon. Nancy was the closest friend that we have for many, many years. With my wife, Sarah, who passed away, they were very close. And we have to remember Nancy on the way that she was. Very bright woman, extremely human. He loved humanity for everybody. And in my time as president of the board, she was my vice president, and we did good things. Like having, and we are no Germans, nor her, nor me. We celebrate Yorkville Oktoberfest every year. She was the instrumental. We are in Germantown, they'll celebrate Germans. Okay, we celebrate German. So you have to remember that Nancy was always the greatest person around. Now, her desire is to be buried. And I took care of that already. And when the ashes are given to me, it will be buried next to my wife and my relative on my grounds in Florida, where I am living mostly now, because she will be put to rest over there. And we are trying to solve the problems, which, you know, in America, I am no American. I mean, I am a citizen, but no longer an American. Everything is complicated here. They have been driving around for 2 months, crazy. But I already decided, I paid the funeral from my own pocket, bury, and we are going to bury and take care of that. So I want to remember Nancy. She's in a better place now. She's with God, our Creator, and she is better than any one of us. God bless you all, and I'm sorry that happened.
Thank you, Jose. I could not have done that well. In closing, all of us here and in our building were Nancy's friends, and I have it written, so I am saying the absolute truth here. You referred to Nancy's smile. In closing, what I wanted to say, what I will always remember, was her warm character and her beautiful smile. Thank you.
Professor Thomas Bird served with Nancy on the scholarship committee of the St. David's Society for many years, and we're very happy to see Professor Bird back from some personal troubles of his own. Anyhow, Professor Thomas Bird.
If you will forgive a personal word, I want to thank many of you here for your thoughts and prayers, cards, calls. They meant a great deal to Mary Lynn and me. As David Williams said, Nancy walked in beauty. She was a beautiful person in everything that she did. Each year, for 15 years, Nancy and I would meet early in June at her home on East 86th Street to go over the St. David's Society scholarship applications. Nancy had furnished her apartment in pastels, punctuated with mementos of her travels. Sipping tea and nibbling grapes, we went through the applications that had arrived, analyzing and ranking them. The funds available from the Society were determined by the President and the Treasurer, and with their figures in hand, we selected the recipients of the 3 largest awards, naming them the Professor Robert Fowkes Award, the Reverend Kenneth Jones Award, and the Anne Phillips Award, fondly remembering 2 former presidents of the St. David's Society of the state of New York, and Anne, who was a longtime member of our chapel family and had been a very generous benefactor to the scholarship fund. The remaining funds were awarded to winners of smaller amounts. On average, 6 to 8 awards in all were made each year. The decisions, the names, amounts, and colleges were sent to the treasurer in time for checks to be cut and sent out by mid-July. Nancy had ranked the applications, had gone through them with a fine-tooth comb before I arrived in what she called a suggested order of worthiness. As her friends know, this gracious, graceful lady, this daughter of the Rhondda Valley, was a consummate, accomplished professional who had held positions of considerable responsibility in the business jungle of New York City, as you heard, at IBM no less. So needless to say, there was never any cause to question her suggested order. As David Morgan said to me, she had trained in Cardiff to be a teacher, and she was a teacher in many venues, even when she was not in the classroom. Indeed, we could not have found a more ideal scholarship chair. Being in Nancy's company was always a memorable pleasure. Her conversation was lively, informed, often challenging. Her manner, in all things, was thoughtful and considerate, sensitive. I count myself blessed to have been numbered among her friends. With many of you, I cherish her memory and mourn her loss to us.
Thank you, Tom. Audrey Roberts was a friend of Nancy's from the Women's Welsh Club. She'd like to say a few words.
Nancy and I became friends, well, fairly recently when we both retired, which is now 25 years ago. But we had a very similar trajectory to being in New York City. We were about the same age. We were both born in South Wales. We both took the scholarship or the 11 plus exam, went to our women's grammar school, then went on to college, then eventually to London when I was married, and then to New York City. So actually, although we've only known each other for 25 years, we have a tremendous amount in common. Most of the time we spent at various Welsh events, St. David's Society, the Eglwys Cymru here, and of course the Women's Welsh Club. And I make a little plug for the Women's Welsh Club. We meet on Saturday, the first Saturday of the month, upstairs here, And we usually have a program, music sometimes, and then afterwards, of course, tea and Welsh cakes and chatter. And I can tell you, Welsh women can talk. So Nancy was a real city person. She loved New York City. And although we went home regularly, both of us, she really enjoyed being in the city most of the time. She had a beautiful apartment, which her friends here have mentioned. And we went to a lot of different Welsh events together. One of the ones that we enjoyed every year, we went to the art show at the town school, which is on 76th Street. We had a friend, a Welsh friend, Cynthia Davis, who actually was an art teacher there, and the principal of the school was Joyce Evans, who was the wife of John Clinton Evans, who was our minister at the time. And we really enjoyed being in a school environment again. But both of us were very glad we didn't have to teach there. We went to, on a couple of occasions, we went down to Delta, Pennsylvania, which is a little town not far from Philadelphia, which has a really strong Welsh connection. And we went there for the Gamanfagani. I drove because Nancy didn't drive. And we were put up by the members of the Rehoboth Church there. And we became really good friends with a lot of people at Delta. And every time they come up, and they come almost every year, to sing the Delta choir here at our Gamanfa. And we always go upstairs, Nancy and I would go upstairs and meet them all for lunch and chat over old times. We really had a lot of fun together. She was a great companion, really great companion. A lot of you have heard now that Nancy was a very pretty woman, and she certainly was. Even as she got old, she was still very pretty. And she must have been a stunning young woman when she lived with the hoi polloi, as she talked about, in London during the late 50s and early 60s. Then in New York City at the IBM headquarters building, she was the epitome of the cultured, charming British lady. Never a hair out of place. And she always liked things just so. I think Nancy would say that she had a happy and fulfilling life. She died peacefully at night in her bed, and a lot of us would enjoy that happening for us too. So we'll miss you, Nancy. Farewell, and God be with you.
Because it's Mother's Day and other reasons, there are many people who could not be here. I would like to thank Carl Davis, Jean, and Ken sitting in the back for coming in. And as Lorraine and I joked, top of the bill, or perhaps side of it, Loran Jones was another good friend of Nancy's for many years.
What can I say about my friend Nancy that you don't already know or haven't already heard this afternoon? But she was a Sagittarius, independent, stubborn, and very candid. She said what she thought, took her own counsel, and did not suffer fools gladly. She loved the life she lived, and to the best of my knowledge, had no regrets. I first met Nancy in the 1980s here in our New York Welsh community, and together with our mutual friend Anne Phillips, I being the designated driver, we took many road trips together, visits to the Welsh community in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, Camanfagani, and in and around the city for various Welsh choirs and Welsh artist events. By the mid-1990s, Nancy and I had become really close friends. She was a regular guest at our home for all the holiday dinners, She loved get-togethers, parties, meeting people, and my family and guests adored Nancy. Through the road trips and her home visits with me, I began to learn more of Nancy's life in Wales, London, and New York, and this strengthened our bond of friendship. Firstly, let me say that New York had become a kind of sanctuary to Nancy. Unlike most of us who came to the United States because of marriage or career opportunity, Nancy's was a quite different story. It was a twist of fate that brought her to New York. The school where Nancy had taught in London served underprivileged, many disenfranchised youth. Having worked there for more than 8 years, Nancy was attacked by a group of female students, and that led to her taking a leave of absence from teaching. Rather than remaining in London or going back to South Wales, Nancy decided to travel around the world. And so she booked passage, and the first port of call was New York City, and there was a match made in heaven. Nancy fell in love with the city, decided to make it her home, resigned her teaching position in London. And Nancy was, as we heard, outgoing, friendly, and through her social contacts was given this interview at IBM and subsequently hired. Also, as we heard, after many years, she became the first woman manager. She broke the glass ceiling. Her title, Manager, Shareholder Relations. Despite the numerous problems and complaints she and her staff dealt with on a daily basis, Nancy recalled that the upside of the job was twofold. One, she had opportunity to travel the country, seeking out venues for IBM's annual shareholder meetings. And two, every day she could look out from her office window and see the Welsh flag proudly flying from the Laura Ashley building. Among Nancy's many friends in those early years in New York were a group of Dutch young women, and soon Nancy was invited to be among the select few to act as escorts for weekend dinner dances on board Dutch ships in New York, visiting New York City. The ladies, in quotes, the ladies were expected to present themselves in evening dress, were driven to the ship where they dined and danced with the officers. The evening would end with polite handshakes all around. Then the ladies were chaperoned off the ship and driven back to their apartments. No hanky-panky, all above board, all very proper, and Nancy liked proper. And Nancy loved telling these stories. She had some good ones. There were some in particular that she recounted many times that connected her life in Wales to the life in New York City, stories of coincidence. And I'd just like to share a couple with you, because every time she retold the stories, I never ceased to be amazed. The first story. After being in this country for some time, Nancy attended a social event here in New York, where during the usual mingle time, she talked to an elderly gentleman, an American ex-serviceman who had been stationed in Britain during the war. After the initial pleasantries, he asked which part of Britain Nancy came from, and when she said she was Welsh, he expressed his delight, saying he'd spent time recuperating in a hospital in South Wales. He told Nancy of the caring and friendliness of the staff at the hospital, and how, despite the hardships, the food rationing and other wartime deprivation, the Welsh people were warm and generous with their time and hospitality. One of the volunteers there had invited him for afternoon tea with her family. And this act of kindness had moved him deeply, so he accepted the invitation and visited the family, who lived on the side of a mountain in a place called Porth. Had Nancy heard of Porth? Nancy's reply, I'm from Porth. And the hospital volunteer who invited you to tea was my mother, Edith Williams. His jaw dropped. Then he responded, you were the scrawny teenager? Coincidence? And one other story was about her brother John. John was a very mysterious child, or to put it in Nancy's words, wicked. During one of his moods, he pulled down the china ornament of Disraeli and Gladstone that sat on the fireplace mantelpiece. He proceeded to carve his initials on the back of the ornament and then bit off a chunk of Disraeli's ear. Fast forward 25 years. Nancy was walking past an antique shop on Madison Avenue when she spotted a Disraeli and Gladstone ornament in the window. Curious as to its value, she went into the shop to inquire. When the assistant took the ornament from the window to look at the price tag, Nancy noticed that Disraeli's ear was missing. On turning it over, carved on the back in large, child-like scribble were the words J.W., John Williams. Another coincidence? So Nancy took these coincidences as an affirmation that she travelled the right path, that all was well with her life journey, that New York was where she was meant to be. As many have alluded today, Nancy was a very attractive woman, and I could tell you stories of the suitors, the ones I listened to time and time again. One, an English aristocrat, had his nanny vet Nancy as to her suitability for marriage. Despite his social standing and lavish country home, Nancy wasn't having any of that. Then there was the Swiss businessman, also living in London when Nancy was there. She got engaged to him, but that romance dissipated too. However, some 15 years after the breakup, his return to Switzerland and Nancy's move to New York, they literally bumped into each other on Fifth Avenue. Another coincidence. And finally, the jet-set romance. Though I could never get Nancy to reveal too much personal information on this gentleman, she did confess that several times a month she would fly out to Los Angeles on a Friday evening, returning on the Sunday night red-eye, so that she could be with her beau on the weekend and back at her desk on Monday morning. I don't know how or where they had met, how long this long-distance romance lasted, or how it ended. All I do know is that Nancy told me that her beau was a Hollywood actor by the name of Jack Lemmon. For the past 5 years, Nancy didn't travel far, and in fact was seen less and less by at our Welsh gatherings. However, she continued, as she had done all her life, to welcome friends and family from around the world who wanted a place to stay while in or travelling through New York. Nancy last ventured to chapel 2 years ago when Cordydd, a choir from Cardiff, visited us. Her relatives in Wales had informed her that her cousin's wife was a member of that choir, and Nancy was anxious to meet her. I last saw Nancy this past December when, as was our usual custom, we celebrated her birthday with dinner. Later, back at her apartment, as was another custom, we talked into the wee hours of the morning. Nancy wanted all the news, from Wales, from the Welsh around the US and of her New York friends. She had recently read Dr. Bill Irving's obituary in Ninnau and spoke so affectionately of him. She reminded me of the lecture Dr. Irving had delivered on growing up Welsh in New York at the English-speaking union that she and I had attended many years before. Nancy, last December, still had her finger on the pulse, had all her faculties, despite her years and limited mobility. I already miss my friend Nancy. I miss the radiance of her presence. She radiated. Her beauty, her smile, and her infectious laugh. And I will miss all those wonderful stories. I'm truly grateful to have known such a lovely, charming, and interesting lady, and to be called her friend. An interesting twist. I was walking across my office to pick up this piece from the printer. I passed by a bookcase of 100 books, and my eyes fell on one title. It wasn't a large book. It was a very thin pastel book on the American Civil War. But the words on the spine stood out. We shall meet again. Nancy, I'm going to take this as your reassurance to me that all is well, and to thank you for that wonderful friendship.
I'm sure we all have more stories, but there will be a Tebach next door, so we can share more stories there. The hymns today were, I'm told, Nancy's favorites, and we'll end this service with the one named after the valley where Nancy lived, Cwm Rhondda, number 40.